Deep in the silent woods, a lonely woodsman lives a life of isolation until one stormy day, a widowed mother and her 3 children cross his path. What begins as a simple act of kindness slowly turns into something far greater than any of them could imagine. Can strangers truly become family? Like, share, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Deep in the northern woods of Montana, where tall pines blocked the sky and snow lingered long into spring, Elijah Turner lived a life shaped by silence. His log cabin stood miles from the nearest town, built by his own hands after the war took everything he once loved. Days were spent cutting timber, nights by the fire with only the crackle of burning wood for company. He spoke to no one, needing no one, or so he believed. The forest was predictable, honest, and cruel only when necessary. Humans, Elijah had learned, were far more complicated and painful to trust. One late afternoon, as dark clouds gathered and icy rain began to fall, Elijah noticed unusual tracks near his property wagon wheels, uneven and fresh. He frowned, uneasy at the intrusion. Few people dared travel these woods so late in the season. As the wind howled louder, a faint cry reached his ears, barely audible over the storm. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his coat and lantern and followed the sound through the trees, each step sinking into wet earth and melting snow. Near the edge of a narrow trail, he found a broken-down wagon tilted into the mud. A woman struggled to pull a soaked blanket tighter around 3 small children huddled beside her. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes wide with fear as she noticed Elijah approaching. Instinctively, she stepped in front of the children, shielding them. Elijah raised his hands to show he meant no harm. He saw then how thin the children were, how their lips trembled from cold. Whatever distrust he carried, it wavered in that moment. The woman introduced herself as Clara Miller, her voice shaking as she explained they were headed west to live with distant relatives. Her husband had died the previous winter, leaving her with debts, grief, and few choices. The wagon axle had snapped hours ago, and the horse had bolted into the storm. They had been walking blindly, hoping to find shelter before nightfall claimed them. Elijah listened silently, the rain soaking through his coat, feeling the weight of their desperation. He hesitated only a moment before offering them his cabin for the night. Clara looked stunned, as if kindness had become unfamiliar to her. The children stared at him with cautious curiosity as he helped them gather what little they could salvage. The walk back to the cabin was slow, Samuel, the youngest, stumbling often until Elijah lifted him onto his shoulder. The child clung to him without fear, a simple trust that unsettled Elijah more than suspicion ever could. Inside the cabin, warmth filled the air as Elijah stoked the fire. Clara settled the children near the hearth, their faces slowly regaining color. Elijah prepared a simple meal of stew and bread, watching quietly as they ate with grateful urgency. Lucy, the middle child, smiled at him shyly, whispering thanks. Ben, the eldest, tried to act brave but kept glancing toward his mother, as if afraid this safety might vanish at any moment. Elijah said little, unsure of how to exist in a space suddenly full of life, as the storm raged outside. Clara shared more of her story, speaking softly so the children could rest. Elijah listened, surprised by how naturally the hours passed. The cabin felt different, smaller, warmer, alive. Laughter slipped out when Samuel giggled in his sleep, and Elijah found himself staring into the fire, remembering a time when such sounds had once been normal to him. He pushed the thought away, reminding himself this was temporary. Nothing more than shelter from the storm. When night deepened, Elijah laid out blankets and gave the family his bed, choosing to sleep near the fire himself. As he closed his eyes, the sounds around him were no longer empty echoes, but gentle breathing and quiet murmurs. He told himself that by morning they would leave and his life would return to the way it had always been. Yet somewhere between the falling snow and the steady rhythm of the cabin, a feeling took root he did not yet recognize as the beginning of something permanent. Morning light filtered through the small cabin windows, pale and uncertain as Elijah woke to unfamiliar sounds. Instead of the usual silence, he heard the soft clatter of dishes and the murmur of a woman's voice. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was, then remembered the family sleeping under his roof. The scent of warm porridge drifted through the room, stirring something gentle and long forgotten in his chest. Clara stood near the stove, carefully stirring a pot, while Lucy swept the floor with a broom too large for her small hands. The sight felt strangely right, and Elijah turned away quickly, unsettled by how much he liked it. After breakfast, Elijah inspected the wagon damage and confirmed what he had suspected. The axle was beyond repair. Clara's face fell when he explained it might take weeks to fix or replace, especially with winter still threatening the mountain passes. She thanked him for his honesty, though worry clouded her eyes. Elijah surprised himself by offering that they stay until the weather improved. He framed it as practicality, but deep down he sensed another reason. Clara agreed reluctantly, determined not to become a burden. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara helped with cooking, mending clothes, and tending a small garden patch near the cabin. Ben followed Elijah everywhere, eager to learn how to use an axe, set traps, and red the forest. Lucy gathered pine cones and wildflowers, filling the cabin with bits of color. Samuel, too young for chores, stayed close to Elijah, often holding his finger as they walked. With each passing day, the cabin grew warmer, not just from the fire, but from shared purpose. At night, stories replaced silence. Clara spoke of her late husband, of hopes once held and futures lost. Elijah, in turn, spoke of his own grief for the first time in years, surprised by how easily the words came in her presence. There was no romance yet, only understanding and a quiet respect that grew between them. The children listened from their blankets, absorbing the comfort of adults who no longer felt like strangers. The woods outside remained vast and lonely, but inside the cabin, something human endured. As weeks passed, spring began to push winter aside. Snow melted into rushing streams, and birds returned to the trees. Clara mentioned leaving more often now, her voice heavy with obligation. She feared staying too long, feared the pain of becoming attached again. Elijah felt the same fear, but in reverse. The thought of returning to an empty cabin made his chest tighten. Still, he said nothing, unsure if he had the right to ask them to stay. One afternoon, while repairing a fence together, Ben called Elijah Sir out of habit, then quickly corrected himself to Pa, his face flushing with embarrassment. The words struck Elijah like a blow and a blessing at once. He said nothing, but that night he lay awake, staring at the rafters, understanding what he had been too afraid to admit. This family had already become part of him, not by choice, but by shared days and quiet care. When Clara finally announced they would leave at the end of the week, Elijah felt the weight of every unsaid word. On the last evening, as the children slept, he spoke at last. He told her the cabin did not feel like a home without them, that he had room not just in his land, but in his life. Clara listened, tears shining in her eyes, her hands trembling as she admitted she felt the same fear of loss, the same longing for belonging. By morning, the decision was made. There would be no journey west, no uncertain future among strangers. The woods, once a place of isolation, would now hold laughter, lessons, and love. Elijah watched the children run through the trees, their voices echoing where silence once ruled. In taking them in, he had not only saved a widow and her children from the cold, he had finally found the family his lonely heart had been waiting for all along.